Quiet moment in many lives when something subtle but unsettling begins to surface. It does not arrive dramatically. There is no single event that announces it. It appears gradually, in conversations that feel repetitive, in the strange realization that the future no longer feels infinite, and in the quiet suspicion that something essential may have been missed along the way. For many people, this moment begins somewhere after 40, not because life suddenly becomes worse, but because something inside the psyche begins asking questions that can no longer be ignored. Questions about meaning, about identity, about the path already taken. And when those questions remain unanswered, something else begins to grow in their place. Bitterness, not the loud, obvious kind, but a quiet emotional heaviness, a subtle resentment toward life itself, a feeling that time moved faster than expected, that opportunities closed quietly, that something important slipped through the hands unnoticed. This bitterness does not come from aging itself. It comes from something much deeper, and strangely, modern culture has almost no language for understanding it. Our culture worships youth, productivity, speed, achievement. The story we are told is simple: build a career, build security, stay relevant, stay useful. But this story only works during the first half of life. It is a story designed for expansion, for building identity in the world. Psychologist Carl Jung believed that the human psyche moves through two fundamentally different phases. The first half of life is about construction. We build a persona, a social identity. We establish roles: professional, parent, partner, citizen. We learn how to survive in society. But Jung observed something fascinating. The psychological tasks that help us succeed in youth become obstacles later in life. The strategies that once built our identity eventually begin to imprison it. And this is where many people become lost, because society keeps telling them to continue playing the same game, even when the inner self has quietly begun demanding something entirely different. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that the most dangerous thing in life is not suffering, it is meaninglessness. And meaninglessness rarely appears suddenly. It grows slowly, like rust beneath the surface of a structure that once seemed strong. At 25, life feels open. At 35, life feels busy. But at 45, something deeper begins to appear: the awareness of time. Not abstract time, personal time. The realization that a large portion of life has already been lived. This realization can be deeply unsettling, not because life is ending, but because the psyche begins evaluating the life that has already unfolded. And this evaluation is rarely superficial, it is existential. Jung believed that bitterness after 40 usually emerges from one central psychological mistake. A person builds an entire life around an identity that was never truly their own, an identity shaped by expectations, by culture, by family pressure, by survival. In youth, this adaptation feels necessary, but eventually the unconscious begins pushing back. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. And for many people, this journey begins only after the structures of the first half of life begin to crack. The tragedy is not aging. The tragedy is reaching midlife and realizing you may have spent decades building a life that does not feel deeply alive. And when this realization arrives, without understanding, it often transforms into bitterness. To understand this more clearly, we can look at 4 psychological stages that quietly unfold during this period of life. Not everyone experiences them consciously, but almost everyone moves through them in some form. Stage 1, the cracks in identity. At first, the change is subtle. A person who once felt motivated begins feeling strangely disconnected from the goals that once mattered. Career achievements feel less satisfying. Status feels strangely hollow. Even success can begin to feel strangely empty. This stage confuses many people. They assume something is wrong with them, but in reality, something deeper is happening. The psyche is signaling that the identity built for survival is no longer enough for meaning. The external structure of life may still function perfectly, but internally, something feels incomplete. Imagine a quiet evening. The house is calm. Perhaps the children are grown, or the career has stabilized. A person sits alone in the living room after everyone else has gone to sleep. The television plays softly in the background, but their mind is somewhere else entirely. They stare at nothing in particular and feel an unfamiliar question emerging. Is this all there is? That question is not depression. It is the psyche awakening. Stage 2, the confrontation with the shadow. According to Jung, every identity we build contains a hidden counterpart, the shadow. The shadow contains everything we suppressed in order to become acceptable to the world. Unchosen dreams, unexpressed talents, unlived possibilities. During youth, the shadow remains mostly unconscious, but in midlife, it begins knocking at the door. Sometimes it appears as regret, sometimes as sudden dissatisfaction, sometimes as envy, when we see others living lives that feel strangely closer to our own hidden desires. If this shadow is ignored, bitterness grows, because the psyche begins feeling betrayed by the life it helped build. This is why some people grow increasingly cynical after 40. They criticize everything. They complain about younger generations. They dismiss new ideas. Often this behavior is misunderstood as simple negativity. But psychologically, it is often something deeper. It is the shadow expressing resentment for the life that was never fully lived. Stage 3, the encounter with meaning. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl believed that the deepest human drive is not pleasure or success. It is meaning. Frankl observed that people can endure immense suffering if they believe their life serves a meaningful purpose. But without meaning, even comfortable lives can feel unbearable. After 40, the psyche becomes increasingly sensitive to this difference. A life built purely around productivity begins to feel psychologically thin. The soul begins searching for depth. This search can take many forms. Some people rediscover creative expression, others turn toward spirituality, others become drawn to mentoring younger generations. But when this search is ignored, the alternative often becomes bitterness. Because without meaning, time begins to feel like loss instead of growth. Stage 4, the path of individuation. Jung believed that the second half of life offers something extraordinary, not decline, but psychological completion. The task of the second half of life is not expansion into the world, it is integration of the self. This means reconciling the parts of ourselves we ignored, revisiting the dreams we abandoned, exploring the inner life that youth left no time to examine. But this process requires courage, because individuation often asks us to question the identity we spent decades building. For example, a successful professional might suddenly feel drawn toward teaching or art. A lifelong caretaker might feel an unfamiliar need for personal freedom. A person who always followed rules might suddenly feel the urge to explore creativity or spirituality. These impulses are not irrational. They are signals from the deeper self, attempting to restore balance. When people follow these signals, something remarkable happens. Bitterness begins transforming into wisdom. Imagine another scene, a hospital corridor late at night. A person sits quietly beside the bed of an aging parent. Machines hum softly in the background. In moments like this, the illusions of life become transparent. Status disappears, career titles disappear, even long-held conflicts seem strangely unimportant. Only a few questions remain. Did I live honestly? Did I become who I truly was? Moments like these reveal something profound. Life is not measured only by years. It is measured by depth, by alignment, by whether the life we lived was truly ours. And this is why bitterness appears for so many people after 40. Because the psyche senses that time is finite and it begins demanding authenticity. But here is the paradox. The same moment that creates bitterness can also become the doorway to transformation, because midlife is not the end of development. Psychologically, it is often the beginning of a deeper life. A life less concerned with appearances, less controlled by expectations, more guided by inner truth. Jung once said that the afternoon of life must have its own meaning, and that meaning cannot simply repeat the goals of youth. It requires a different orientation, one that turns inward as much as outward, one that values understanding over achievement, depth over speed, wholeness over perfection. Many people never receive permission to make this transition. They believe it is too late, too risky, too unconventional. So they continue living exactly as before. But internally, the soul grows quieter and the bitterness slowly deepens. Yet for those who listen carefully, something else becomes possible. A second life, not a different life externally, but a deeper life internally. A life where identity becomes less rigid, where curiosity returns, where wisdom begins replacing ambition. And strangely, this stage of life can become the most psychologically rich period a person ever experiences. Not because the world changes, but because the relationship with oneself finally begins to deepen. One day, everyone eventually faces the same realization. Life was never meant to be a single, uninterrupted climb. It is a transformation, a movement from outer construction to inner understanding. And bitterness is not the enemy, it is a signal that the soul is asking for something more honest, something more complete, something more true. If we listen to that signal, midlife becomes a threshold instead of a trap, the beginning of becoming fully human. Not the person the world expected, but the person who was quietly waiting within all along. And if reflections like this resonate with you, if you find yourself thinking more deeply about identity, meaning, and the inner life, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who might also be asking these questions. Because the search for understanding is one journey no one should walk entirely alone.